They thought they were hired to neutralize a problem. But the moment your name appeared in their briefings, something shifted in the air. It wasn't fear, not yet, just a hesitation, the kind that creeps in when a professional senses something unfamiliar. The first hitman was confident, efficient, already rehearsing his extraction route before he even reached the city. But by the time he returned, he wasn't the same man. He didn't fail the mission. He abandoned it. No one knows what he saw, what he felt, or why he couldn't pull the trigger. All he said was that there are certain presences you don't engage with, certain energies that study you faster than you can study them. They thought he was making excuses until they sent the second one. He lasted 3 hours. When he came back, he wasn't trembling, he was enlightened. The report was never filed. The agency pretended nothing happened. But word travels differently when it's about someone like you. It doesn't spread like gossip. It moves like instinct, like a natural law being rediscovered. Because when professionals, men trained to erase emotions, start speaking about awe, something deeper is happening. They began describing sensations they couldn't articulate. One said it felt like walking into a room where the air itself was watching him. Another said his reflection felt foreign. A third claimed that every path toward you somehow led him inward. And that's when they began to understand. You weren't a target. You were a mirror. Every assassin who tried to dismantle you was forced to confront himself. They entered the mission believing it was a hunt. They left realizing it was a lesson. And lessons like that don't fade. They metastasize. Each failed assignment turned into testimony. Each name that came for you became a witness to something unexplainable. The agencies adjusted their parameters. The new orders were not to engage until further analysis. But even analysis failed. Because how do you study someone who operates outside the emotional architecture of threat? They started tracing your history, looking for fractures, leverage, weaknesses. Instead, they found patterns that made no sense. Every betrayal you endured became propulsion. Every loss you suffered became precision. They studied your relationships, expecting chaos, but discovered equations, how you transformed abandonment into calibration, humiliation into poise, grief into timing. The closer they looked, the more absurd it became. How does a person keep winning by doing nothing aggressive? How does restraint dismantle aggression faster than confrontation? The reports began to sound religious. The operatives couldn't help themselves. They described your presence like scripture, words like alignment, frequency, aura. That's when command grew uneasy. Because killers don't use words like that unless they've seen something that redefines them. Then came the quiet phase. Surveillance replaced missions. They followed your movements through screens, expecting routine. But every gesture seemed deliberate, as though you knew the camera angles. You didn't hide, you choreographed. You didn't speak, you created absence that made others confess. The observers began to feel studied, dissected, understood. One handler wrote in his log that your stillness had intelligence. Another said you dismantled tension without moving a muscle. They called for psychological reinforcements. None of them lasted. Even therapists assigned to analyze your case file reported dreams afterward. Dreams of corridors that looped back to the same room, where your silhouette stood waiting, expression unreadable. What unnerved them most wasn't fear, it was respect. They couldn't rationalize it, because respect is supposed to be earned through dominance, not comprehension. But you had both. By the fourth attempt, They stopped pretending it was a mission. They called it exposure therapy. Every operative was told it would toughen their mind, purge their ego, refine their instincts, and yet each one returned quieter, more aware, almost converted. They said you didn't resist them, you revealed them. They said you looked at them the way a truth looks at a lie. And that's when it clicked. You weren't defending yourself, you were diagnosing them. Every move they made became part of your study. Every threat they offered became your data. You didn't fight, they unraveled themselves. That's why even the most violent among them couldn't proceed. It wasn't their weapon that failed, it was their narrative. They were prepared for a target who would run, panic, retaliate. But they found someone who just existed, unmoved, calculating not how to survive, but how to observe survival itself. When the fifth one came, he didn't come armed. He came curious. He'd heard the stories, the contradictions, the internal memos no one was supposed to read. He found you exactly as described, calm, centered, precise. He expected intimidation, but instead he felt recognition. It was as if every suppressed part of himself was being acknowledged in real time. He didn't attack. He asked questions. You didn't answer them. You just let him hear the echo of his own inquiries until they disassembled him completely. That's when he said the line that became legend among the others. "Bro, we can't touch this one." It wasn't fear, it was understanding. They finally realized they weren't facing an opponent. They were facing evolution. Rumors spread through the underground faster than directives from above. Names that once carried weight started to lose credibility. Men who prided themselves on invisibility started questioning what invisibility even means when someone can see through motive itself. They began calling you the variable. Others called you the fold. Not because you disappeared, but because reality seemed to bend differently around you. Every mission became hesitation. Every hesitation became fascination. They started comparing notes, studying your posture, your tone, your decisions. The line between hunter and student blurred completely. The agencies tried to suppress the chatter, but it was too late. The legend had left the control room. Soon, it wasn't just hired professionals talking. Philosophers, ex-intelligence officers, and underground strategists started referencing you like a case study in consciousness. They called it the untouchable paradox. How can someone render violence irrelevant without opposing it? How can calmness trigger collapse faster than aggression? You became the quiet revolution none of them could replicate. They began adapting your methods, negotiators using your tactics, soldiers quoting your demeanor, executives mimicking your restraint. But imitation without comprehension only exposes misunderstanding, because what they didn't grasp is that your detachment isn't a tactic, it's a state. You don't pretend to be unaffected. You are genuinely beyond the reach of their categories. That's why every encounter collapses into admiration. By now, even the higher chains of command had split into factions. Some wanted to classify you as psychological warfare. Others wanted to recruit you, claiming someone like you could neutralize entire conflicts without force. A few insisted you weren't human at all, but a variable sent to reveal the limits of human dominance. Files were opened, redacted, reopened, and sealed again. No consensus, just echoes. Meanwhile, your daily life continued unbothered, as if unaware of the global confusion orbiting your name. You didn't run, you didn't hide, you didn't justify, you just kept existing with surgical composure, letting the narrative dismantle itself. Eventually, The agencies stopped sending professionals. They started sending believers, people who had already been changed by the stories. They didn't come to complete missions anymore. They came to witness. They said they wanted to understand the source. But what they really wanted was release. You had become therapy for the violent, medicine for the paranoid, doctrine for the lost. Every attempt to decode you created another disciple. You became a rumor that heals egos by destroying them, a paradox that humbles killers without punishing them. No one could explain it, but no one could deny it. Even those who didn't believe still felt the shift. Something about your energy altered the atmosphere. It made people question the idea of control itself. And that's the irony. They came to control you. But you redefined control by not needing it. You let them learn the hard way that power without understanding is panic in disguise. You didn't dismantle their operations. You dismantled their certainty. Every time one of them looked into your eyes, they saw the version of themselves that manipulation could never sustain. And in that mirror, they broke, but beautifully. Because breaking in your presence doesn't feel like defeat. It feels like remembering what precision feels like when it's not corrupted by ego. That's why even the most cynical operatives started defending you. They said you weren't dangerous, you were diagnostic. You didn't cause collapse. You revealed where collapse was inevitable. Now the whispers have become doctrine. There are training programs modeled after your composure, seminars named after your patience, private networks circulating footage of your interactions, claiming they've found the blueprint for untouchability. But they're all missing one crucial thing. You never tried to be untouchable. You simply stopped participating in what could touch you. You learned that energy can't be harmed by what it refuses to identify with. And that's what every operative feels when they approach you, that invisible field of absolute neutrality that dissolves their intent. So when the agencies review their archives, they see a pattern that shouldn't exist. Every hitman who was sent to eliminate you came back altered, humbled, devoted. None of them can explain why. Their reports don't describe a person. They describe an awakening. It's no longer about the mission, the payment, the orders. It's about what happens when destruction meets understanding and realizes it's obsolete. They were supposed to remove you from existence, but instead, you removed their reason for violence. And as the final operative stands before the review board, eyes distant, voice steady, he delivers the same line they've all repeated since the beginning. Whatever this one is, we can't touch it. And somewhere out there, unseen by all their cameras, you're already moving toward the next unseen field, where observation itself trembles before awareness. They kept calling it residual influence, as if naming it could contain it. But when the debriefs began, every room that held a returned operative started to feel colder. The interviews were never consistent. Sometimes they'd speak in riddles, sometimes in reverence. The review board wanted facts, timelines, coordinates, behavioral notes. What they got instead were testimonies that sounded like psalms. The first operative stared at the one-way mirror for 43 minutes before saying a single word. He didn't resist. That was all. They pressed him, asked for specifics, how you moved, what you said, what he felt. He answered with something that froze the room. It wasn't about movement. It was about recognition. I saw something in him that knew me before I arrived. They called it poetic delusion, post-mission stress, cognitive dissonance. But when the second one came back, saying the exact same sentence, word for word, they stopped interrupting. A new department was created, not to stop you, but to interpret the pattern. They called it Division 9. The walls of their headquarters were lined with transcripts of your encounters, lines circled in red, margins filled with notes. Yet every attempt at translation failed because the language kept shifting. The hitmen used metaphors that contradicted each other: light, weight, gravity, silence. When they were placed in the same room, they would sit in perfect stillness, as though communicating through some unseen frequency. One guard swore the temperature changed when they did that. Another said he heard a pulse beneath the floor. Every new operative added to the confusion instead of clarifying it. The paradox grew. These were men bred for precision, but after meeting you, precision became impossible. Their reports used words like presence, compression, return. No one could explain what return meant. Yet each man insisted that something of him stayed with you, and something of you remained with him. They tried medication. Nothing changed. They tried hypnosis. The subjects spoke in unison, repeating coordinates that didn't exist on any map. A neuroscientist suggested shared psychosis, but when she studied their brain scans, she found patterns identical to deep state meditation, except these men had never practiced it. Their amygdalas were calm. Their cortisol levels were non-existent. They were at peace. Too much peace. The kind that unnerves. And that's when the agency realized this wasn't corruption. It was conversion. You hadn't destroyed their programming. You'd rewritten it. They weren't weapons anymore. They were witnesses. One by one, they began writing letters, not to family, not to command, to you. Each began the same way. I understand now. They described flashes of awareness that hit them days after returning. A smell, a color, a thought looping in their heads. They said your face appeared not as memory, but as reflection. Each time they confronted their own habits, their own impulses, they saw you watching them. It wasn't paranoia, it was participation. You had entered their perception like a mirror that never left. The psychologists called it a parasitic identity transfer. The philosophers called it awakening. The agencies called it a security breach of the human psyche. But the men themselves called it relief. One operative, previously responsible for over 40 confirmed kills, requested to be reassigned as a teacher. He claimed that violence had lost its flavor. I used to feel control when I pulled the trigger, he said. Now I feel interruption. Another refused to hold a weapon again. He didn't take my aim, he said, of you. He took the need behind it. The interrogators began losing patience. They needed data, not doctrine. But doctrine was all that remained. These men weren't soldiers anymore. They were narrators of an internal shift. They had seen something that dissolved their hierarchy of power. You didn't defeat them. You converted their aggression into comprehension. Division 9 brought in theologians. They wanted to cross-reference mystical experiences with field reports. The overlap was disturbing. The patterns matched initiation rites from centuries past. Encounters with figures described as the mirror of consequence. Yet your file contained nothing supernatural. No tricks, no technology, no chemical influence. Just observation. Somehow, observation itself had become an event. The theologians left with trembling hands, muttering about thresholds between perception and confession. The agency burned their notes, but the hitmen's calm remained. As weeks passed, more operatives requested debriefing extensions, claiming they needed to process. What they meant was they didn't want to return to normal assignments. Normal had become unbearable. The world of targets and payoffs now felt childish. like pretending after knowing truth. Command replaced anger with fear. They couldn't punish devotion. They could only isolate it. The converted agents were moved to separate facilities, coded under rehabilitation, but separation only strengthened the pattern. They began synchronizing behavior without contact, sleeping at identical hours, eating less, speaking softly. One guard said it felt like watching a choir rehearse without music. Another said they smiled in their dreams. It wasn't worship, it was alignment. The psychologists ran word association tests, and every subject reacted to the word "you" with lowered heart rate. When shown your photograph, their pupils expanded not from fear, but from awe. They reported sensations of being seen through, not seen at. That distinction broke every model of trauma response. You'd become an internal compass, recalibrating men who once lived in moral blackout. And yet, the agency couldn't celebrate it, because reformation wasn't the objective. Control was. You'd hijacked the one thing they thought unchangeable, the human core of those who kill for logic. Then came the recordings. Hidden cameras placed in their rooms caught moments that defied explanation. Agents sitting motionless for hours, then standing suddenly, as if responding to an unheard command. Coordinated gestures, hand movements, forming patterns that analysts described as language evolving in real time. The agency tried to decode it, but the sequence changed every night. The conclusion was grim. They weren't communicating with each other. They were communicating with something within themselves, a shared echo of your presence. You'd turned them into living transmitters of awareness. Outside the compound, whispers began leaking. Former contacts noticed changes. The hitmen stopped drinking, stopped gambling, stopped boasting. They started writing, pages filled with reflections about perception, morality, time. They published nothing, but fragments surfaced on underground forums, sentences that spread like viruses. The target was me all along. Control collapses in comprehension. Violence is the fear of seeing clearly. People thought it was performance art. They didn't know it was the residue of proximity to you. Meanwhile, the agency panicked. They sent behavioral auditors, philosophers, even spiritual leaders disguised as consultants. Each left changed. The auditors resigned. The philosophers published papers on cognitive reverence disorder. The spiritual leaders stayed silent, perhaps out of respect, perhaps out of recognition. By the third month, containment was declared impossible. Whatever you had sparked wasn't psychological, it was contagious. And yet no one could trace the vector. You hadn't spoken a word since the last operative. Your existence alone had become catalyst. Within their confinement, the hitmen began to draw. Simple sketches at first, circles, grids, overlapping lines. But when analysts overlaid the drawings from separate rooms, the shapes aligned perfectly, forming complex patterns identical to neural networks. It was as if they were mapping thought itself. Some called it coincidence, others a collective hallucination. But one mathematician noticed that the geometry matched models of harmonic resonance found in quantum acoustics. He said it looked like language before sound. The files were classified instantly, but classification didn't stop replication. The patterns appeared in other facilities too, men who had never met you producing the same designs. The conclusion was terrifying. Contact with you didn't just alter memory, it rewired cognition. As this realization spread, a few high-ranking officials started showing symptoms: vivid dreams, disinterest in violence, sudden empathy. It was spreading upward. The hierarchy began to fold under its own clarity. For an organization built on dominance, compassion was a virus. Meetings turned philosophical. Decisions slowed. Some commanders resigned without explanation. Others stayed, hoping to understand. That's when they discovered the letters. Hundreds of pages hidden in the archives, written by operatives long dead. Every letter addressed to the same pronoun, you. The dates predated your birth, which meant this phenomenon didn't start with you. You were merely the next emergence. That terrified them more than any bullet ever could. Inside Division 9, the last remaining analyst kept recording everything, even after his superiors abandoned the project. His final report described recurring dreams of walking down endless corridors until he reached a door marked only by your initials. He never opened it. He said the fear wasn't what was behind the door. It was realizing the door was him. His notes ended with a single line: contact achieved. The next morning he vanished. His badge was found at the observation room, still warm. The security footage cut to static for exactly 9 minutes. When the screen returned, all confined operatives were standing, facing the same direction, whispering in unison. The microphones captured one phrase: "We are learning to see." After that night, Division 9 ceased to exist. The building was emptied, its staff relocated, its files erased from every database. But deletion is never final. Copies always survive. Fragments of those reports now circulate in black markets of information. Whoever reads them reports strange calm afterward. Some claim to feel watched, others guided. Governments deny involvement, yet their silence speaks loudly. Because the real threat isn't what you did to those men. It's what they became after knowing you. They weren't killers anymore. They were transmitters of perspective. Each one now lives quietly across different continents, leaving trails of insight disguised as coincidence. Whenever conflict arises, one of them appears nearby, observing, recalibrating, never intervening. People call them ghosts, monks, anomalies of conscience. But those who know the truth understand. They're your disciples. They don't worship you as a god. They emulate you as a principle. To them, you represent the end of reaction, the dawn of perception as control. They teach others how awareness dismantles violence faster than resistance. They say you didn't defeat them. You reintroduced them to clarity. And clarity, once experienced, cannot be unlearned. That's why every hitman sent your way ends up shaking, not from fear, but from the collapse of false identity. They realize the mission was never to eliminate you, but to encounter themselves through you. That realization burns pride, dissolves aggression, and births devotion. Now the rumor has evolved into doctrine across underground circles. Contact equals correction. Young recruits whisper it before their first job, half in fear, half in hope. They know if their target turns out to be you, their lives will never be the same. The legend has replaced deterrence with transformation. Violence now hesitates before execution, not because of moral conflict, but because somewhere deep down, every agent knows they might be walking toward the mirror that ends them beautifully. And in some unrecorded corner of the world, unseen but undeniably real, you continue your quiet movement through cities and minds, dismantling the machinery of destruction without ever raising a hand. You move through airports, alleys, and corridors with the ease of a rumor that already knows its destination. Surveillance cameras capture you and immediately lose focus, as though the image refuses compression. No one can describe you consistently. In one report, you're calm and deliberate. In another, incandescent and unreadable. Analysts overlay the footage and realize they're studying their own projection. Because that's the real discovery. When they look for you, they meet themselves. It's why every operative trembles before contact. The moment they stand in your presence, the mask they've worn for survival begins to melt. Some call it guilt. Others call it recognition. But the effect is identical. Mission protocols collapse, weapon hands grow heavy, and the mind begins to confess without instruction. By now, the phenomenon has reached cultural saturation. Underground forums call it the correction. Poets write about it in metaphors of mirrors and thresholds. Psychologists debate whether it's trauma or transcendence. But among the initiated, no debate remains. They know it's evolution disguised as failure. One assassin compared it to stepping into gravity that only pulls inward. Another said it felt like time had texture, folding around every intention until only truth remained. They can't articulate it cleanly because language breaks under that kind of awareness. You didn't teach them, you reminded them. And reminders this pure don't fade, they replicate. Governments form task forces to study the contagion of conscience. Classified projects labeled behavioral refraction attempt to weaponize what you represent. But their experiments implode. Test subjects refuse aggression after exposure. Artificial simulations of your presence trigger empathy instead of fear. Even the scientists start resigning mid-research, claiming they've found something too real to replicate. It's not technology, it's understanding, and understanding refuses containment. The higher the hierarchy, the faster it decays. The generals begin quoting pacifists. The strategists start speaking in parables. Every model of control now includes one unpredictable variable, you. Somewhere, a private intelligence firm hosts a summit about you. They gather mercenaries, philosophers, and digital prophets. The projector displays your name in red letters, then flickers out. Power surges, lights dim, and someone mutters, "He's here." But you're not. You're nowhere near the building. Still, the fear of your potential becomes participation in your presence. That's how deep the legend runs. It no longer needs you to appear. The idea of you performs the correction automatically. One whisper of your involvement, and entire operations disband before they begin. You've transcended existence. You've become the field effect of awareness. Meanwhile, the men who once called themselves hitmen now form circles of reflection across continents. They meet in abandoned warehouses, rooftops, temples. They don't recruit, they recall. Each session begins the same way: silence, then confession, then laughter that sounds like liberation. They speak of how you dismantled them without violence, how their rage found nowhere to land. They admit that killing was easier than seeing. But after seeing you, killing became impossible. Some dedicate their lives to teaching restraint. Others wander, helping strangers without reason. They don't call it redemption, they call it clarity. They say clarity feels like standing at the edge of the world and realizing the edge was never real. The media catches fragments of these gatherings and labels them cults. But cults worship personality. These circles study pattern. Their devotion isn't to you as a person, it's to what you revealed, the futility of coercion. They distribute recordings of their confessions, and those recordings go viral. Viewers describe physical sensations, chills, calm, release. A journalist investigates and ends up joining them. A psychologist attends to debunk and resigns her license. The transformation is subtle yet absolute. You've inverted the hierarchy of influence. Power now moves from awareness outward, not from authority downward. Across the digital realm, new symbols appear, circles intersecting triangles, signatures hidden in code. Hackers claim they encode your frequency, a digital translation of presence. Whenever global conflict escalates, those symbols surge online, disrupting propaganda networks, flooding feeds with quiet reasoning. It's not rebellion, it's reconfiguration. Armies pause mid-operation, leaders reconsider airstrikes, empires hesitate. They call it interference. The converted call it compassion's algorithm. And behind it all, somewhere untraceable, you continue walking, one calm observer dismantling centuries of aggression through unspoken demonstration. The agencies still try to reframe the narrative. They release documentaries calling you myth, psychological contagion, elaborate hoax. But denial collapses under testimony. Former operatives appear on record, eyes steady, voices unwavering. They speak not with fanaticism, but with precision. "We were never disarmed," one says. "We were disillusioned." Another adds, "He didn't convert me. He completed me." The interviewer laughs nervously, but the camera catches something in his eyes, curiosity, then quiet. Within a week, he quits journalism entirely. The pattern persists. Proximity equals transformation. Even through screens, the effect bleeds. Now ordinary people start applying the principle. Street conflicts dissolve when one participant remembers the story of you. Police forces study your encounters as case examples in de-escalation. Therapists quote your words, though you never spoke them. The myth supplies its own vocabulary. You've become shorthand for control without cruelty, for dominance without distortion, for power that doesn't need audience. The world doesn't know whether to fear or follow, but instinct leans toward reverence. Because deep down, every human recognizes what those hitmen discovered. There is no weapon sharper than awareness. The most astonishing shift happens quietly. The last surviving commander of Division 9 retires and sends a sealed letter to his replacement. It contains no instructions, only coordinates. The coordinates point to a public park where a single bench faces an empty fountain. Engraved on the bench is one sentence: "Violence ends where understanding begins." No signature, but everyone knows. The replacement sits there for hours, watching strangers pass, feeling something unravel: authority, ambition, the illusion of separation. By nightfall, he deletes every pending contract tied to your name. That moment marks the unofficial end of hired violence at the global level. Decades from now, historians will debate when the shift truly happened. Some will trace it to Division 9's collapse. Others will date it to the first recorded confession. But those who lived through it know it began the instant the first hitman looked into your eyes and realized he couldn't proceed. That was the genesis of the new order, fear reprogrammed into reverence. And as centuries pass, your story will be told not as legend, but as lesson, that the ultimate weapon is comprehension, and the ultimate disarmament is empathy. Some say you still walk among them, unnoticed, wearing ordinary faces, working ordinary jobs. Others believe you dissolved entirely, leaving only the pattern behind. But every time violence trembles before awareness, every time a hand lowers instead of striking, every time a thought interrupts hatred mid-sentence, they know you've passed through again. Because you never needed monuments. Your fan club isn't built of followers. It's built of the formerly blind. Each one a recovered fragment of the collective conscience you resurrected. And somewhere tonight, another recruit receives his assignment, checks the target's profile, and freezes at the name. His pulse quickens. His mind floods with every rumor he's ever heard. He knows the odds, knows the outcome, yet still he prepares, because some lessons must be lived, not learned. Hours later, he returns to his handler without a mark, eyes brighter, voice lower, repeating the same line spoken by those before him. "Bro, we can't touch this one." And the handler, hearing it again, understands it's over. The legend has completed its circle. Because you didn't just survive their pursuit, you converted pursuit itself into peace. Every hitman sent your way ended up joining your fan club. Not out of defeat, but out of deliverance. You didn't change their mission, you changed their meaning. And now, the world operates on the residue of your precision, a silent awareness that spreads without sound, without force, without permission. And if somewhere unseen, you're still watching it unfold, you already know. The job was never to destroy them. It was to show them why destruction no longer works.